Welcome. Thank you very much for coming here today. My name is Izabela Kalinowska, and I'm Associate Professor in the Department of European Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. And we meet here today to remember that before the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, before those momentous events that we associate with the collapse of communism, there was solidarity in 1980. Thanks to the courtesy of the Consulate General of the Republic of Poland in New York, Stony Brook can host an exhibit that traces the genesis of solidarity, a nonviolent social movement that played a crucial role in the chain of events leading to the collapse of communism in East Central Europe. I would like to thank Mark Aronoff, who is not here, but thank you anyway, Senior Advisor to the Provost, Charles Robbins, Vice Provost of Undergraduate Education, Donna Di Donato, Assistant Provost, for the support they provided to the idea of today's panel. Thanks also to Nick Rrzewski, the chairman of my department, for his support and help, and Nadine Greenstein for the assistance in organizing today's panel. For the sake of the younger part of our audience, let me recount very briefly the moment of Solidarity's birth and provide a little bit of an epilogue before I proceed to introduce our distinguished guests here today. In the summer of 1980, Polish workers at the Lenin Shipyard in Gdansk decided to claim their right to independent representation. They went on strike to protest the continuously rising food prices. They also demanded that two people who had been fired from the Lenin Shipyard, Anna Walentinowicz and Lech Walesa, be reinstated. They were fired because of their activities for the sake of independent unions. The right to form independent unions free from Communist Party control became the #1 demand of the striking workers in August of 1980 in Gdańsk. News of the Gdańsk strike spread to other regions of the country, and other workers started to join in. Lech Walesa emerged as the leader of the Gdańsk Union and the movement that was soon to engulf the entire country. And the organization adopted the name Solidarity. I think I have a slide with Walesa somewhere there. So here's Walesa. Eventually, the government, crippled by factory shutdowns, was forced to give in to workers' demands. Solidarity, the first independent labor union in the Soviet bloc, was legalized. These gains proved not to be very long-lasting. In December of 1981, the communist government declared martial law. Solidarity was delegalized, and its leaders, including Walesa, were arrested and imprisoned. Solidarity went underground, but it continued to receive support from, among others, from the Polish people, first of all, from the Catholic Church in Poland, from American labor unions, and many others. Between 82 and 85, Walesa and other Solidarity members were released from prison. Solidarity continued to organize protests, strikes. Finally, in 1988, the government agreed to negotiate with Solidarity. The resulting roundtable talks changed the political landscape of Poland forever. In 1989, Solidarity was legalized and permitted to enter its candidates in the elections that followed. The collapse of communism in Poland was the first event in a chain reaction That included, as I have already pointed out, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, similar movements throughout East Central Europe, and eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let me now introduce the esteemed panelists in the order in which they are going to appear today. Ewa Junczyk-Ziomecka, the Consul General of the Republic of Poland in New York. I think her presence here speaks best about the legacy of solidarity, as the current Consul General was a rebellious journalist who joined the striking workers back in 1980. Richard Hornik, he was also an eyewitness to solidarity, as he headed the Warsaw Bureau of Time magazine at that time, from 1981 to 1983. Just one moment in his distinguished career as a news person, and I was delighted to have a chance to listen to Mr. Hornik at the Polish consulate last fall, and very pleasantly surprised to discover that he actually lectures at Stony Brook in our very own School of Journalism. Following Rick Hornik, Andrzej Tymowski. Andrzej, he is the Director of International Programs at the American Council of Learned Societies and the co-author of the exhibit that I hope everybody had a chance to see in the hall of the Center, Human Solidarity, Polish Solidarnosc. And the last speaker, last but not least, Timothy Moran, Associate Professor in our Department of Sociology. Tim works on problems related to social inequality and mobility. Welcome them all once again. Thank you very much once again for accepting our invitation, and I'd like to ask the Consul General to address you now.
I hope that you allow me to sit. Do you agree if I sit? Thank you very much. Dzień dobry, good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to all of you for your presence here, and to Professor Kalinowska-Blackwood, because thanks to her and thanks to you, this, I hope, meaningful and important afternoon is possible. The exhibit that is outside, entitled Human Solidarity, Polish Solidarnosc, reminds the birth of the 10 million strong solidarity movement. At that time, the population in Poland was over 30 million. So there's a 1/3 of the society which were together in this solidarity movement. Striving for freedom and democracy expressed in 1980, it was 30 years ago. In our history is nothing, in our lifetime is something. But it was only 30 years ago. The group of Gdansk Shipyard workers became a common goal, that this freedom and democracy became a common goal of the overwhelming majority of Poles who simply demand rights to esteem and respectful life. All that happened in 1980 in the shipyard of Gdansk, by the way, at that time, the shipyard name was Lenin Shipyard in Gdansk, beginning with a woman. You could see her on the exhibition, a little woman. When you on the street will walk by her, you wouldn't pay any attention. Just a very small woman, Anna Walentinowicz. It's important to remember this name, Anna Walentinowicz, for many called the mother of Solidarnosc movement. She was a shipyard worker since 1950, and she was involved, and she was activist for workers' rights. By the way, she was killed last year in the president's of Poland plane crashed near Smolensk. That will be in a month. That will be a year ago. But 30 years ago, when 5 months prior to her retirement, she was dismissed, the whole shipyard stood in her defense. That was the first sign of a solidarity. We are behind her. When strike was close to collapse, and men and the other workers were tired and ready to return home, Anna Walentinowicz and 3 other women stopped workers and prompted them to continue the protest, because at that time to go on strike was to stay in a shipyard without returning back home. And when it happened, not many people outside Gdansk knew about it. In Warsaw, nobody knew about it. In Krakow, nobody. Even in small cities in the Baltic Sea, the people did not know about it. And we have to remember that in the summer of 1980, only pieces of information from Gdańsk were reaching Warsaw and other major cities in Poland. For young generation, it was a time without computers. It was a time without emails, a time without Facebooks, Twitter, not mention cell phones. Even just regular old-fashioned phones were not many Poles at that time have at home just a regular phone. So for most of we have one source of information. That was the Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. And because that was the only reliable source of information, that was jailed by communists. But we felt in other cities that something important must happen, because the telephone lines were cut out. So those who had the telephones in institutions at home, they couldn't call anyone to check whether is this true what the Radio Free Europe is telling us? Is this true? So what Voice of America is telling us, that something happened in Gdańsk. At that time I was a journalist, and as many maybe of you, I believed that everything important happened to my parents or to my grandparents, and nothing important happened in my life, nothing important in my professional life. I was at the beginning of a journalist work, and I remember I envy those people who remember the war, who were heroes during the Second World War, who remember the first protest against communism in 1956. And suddenly my generation at that time had nothing in our bios. It was so boring in communism, it was so boring. But something, the gossips and those Radio Free Europe information that something going on in Gdańsk made me and my husband went there. Of course, we had to hide in our newspapers that we are going to Gdańsk, and we just pretended we are going for a summer vacation. We took our daughter and we went there. And soon we realized that really many people are going toward the shipyard in Gdańsk. Unfortunately, the workers at the Gdansk Shipyard were not willing to let us inside. Why? Because we were journalists and we work in the official press under the censorship. We looked with envy at foreign journalists as Mr. Hornik, who were welcome. They said Time magazine, New York Times, the Washington Post, and everybody were clapping and were so happy. Because why they were so happy? because workers believe that once they will be inside the shipyard, they will write a story about it. And then the free world in Europe, in the United States, will know that workers are against the communists, that there is something going on the Baltic Sea in Poland. So we waited, waving to those foreign journalists arriving one by one, until we finally realized that two of our friends were already inside. They were journalists, Polish journalists, cooperating with CORE. The CORE, very important, first underground opposition, democratic opposition, organized in a structure, Workers' Defense Committee. And they were look at us, they said, well, okay, you can trust them, let them in. You wouldn't believe how this place looked at that time over there. The atmosphere at the shipyard was amazing. It felt like ongoing rally. People were very, very emotional. I remember some were looking for a cross, yes, find a cross on the wall, and he renouncing his membership in the Communist Party. Other people were collecting money for the memorial of the shipyard workers killed in 1970, 10 years ago. And there were many who remembered that, and they were afraid. Because who knew, maybe it could happen again, that the police would start to shoot workers. That was a great time of expectations and a great determination. Imagine the crowd on two sides of gates which was the enter to the shipyard, and those gates were full of John Paul II pictures and Virgin Mary hung on the main gate of the shipyard, and they acted as a protective shield. Let me remind you that 2 years before, in 1978, Polish Cardinal Wojtyła was elected as Pope John Paul II. And a year later, in 1979, he visited Poland. And a year later, 1980, workers went on strike in the shipyard. Workers were saying, Polish soldiers or the Polish police will not shoot the Pope. What they meant, the image of the Pope, and the tank will not pass by the altar. Well, there was this fear that I mentioned, and some people were even willing to go to the confession just in case. And there was an organized site when the long quote, the confession in the middle of shipyard were there, and workers receiving the Holy Communions. And I still remember some people recalling that the last time that I had a confession was 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, maybe 30. So now they decided to make it again, just in case. The workers on strike were encouraged by their wives, standing on the other side of the shipyard's gate. Women struggling to survive in a difficult time were coming each day to the gate, bringing food, clothes to their husbands, brothers, boyfriends. And they were repeating, I still remember they were repeating, sit here, stay here, do not go back home. And the people were staying there waiting for the communist government official reaction. But what they expected for the communist official representatives to come from the capital of Poland to Gdansk. And in the meantime, each day, new delegation from different factories in Poland and different small and big cities were arriving to the Gdansk, joining the strike committee. At that time, at about 40 journalists, Polish journalists, were there, and we journalists began to feel uncomfortable, unable to publish anything because of the censorship. We were the only group that did not join the committee. So one day we met under the tree growing in the courtyard and prepared a special statement of the Polish journalists present at the shipyard. The statement that we are on the side against the communist administration. It was already the 25th of August. For many journalists, however, signing the statement was a huge life decision. We were wondering if there will be any repressive measures taken against us. I must tell you now, without the name, that one of our colleagues who signed the statement later grabbed the list of signatures and literally ate it. Yeah. Nevertheless, we come out with an official statement knowing that we took a right but risky decision. Of course, our names were published, not published. They were, through Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. I was immediately expelled from my newspaper. From today's perspective, this whole might look like a little grotesque, but then, on the 25th of August, we shown our disapproval to the entire propaganda used in media against workers on strike. Finally, representatives of the communist government arrived to the shipyard. The Washington Post wrote on its front page, "A dialogue without precedent in history has been taking place in Poland, within earshot of the entire world." When negotiation with workers began, also other people joined the workers. Actors, writers, poets, intellectuals, everybody were on the road to Gdansk. And a day before an agreement was signed, it was such an overwhelming happiness because we felt like the whole Poland is in the shipyard. Everybody wanted to express its solidarity. Everybody would like to be there in this very moment. And as I said, we very young people at that time, for the first time in our life, we felt that we are participating in something which has a meaningful and a historical weight. So for the first time, we felt that not only our parents and grandparents participate in something which was very important, but also our biography was written in this very moment. On August 1908, history chose the city of Gdansk as a site where the 20th century began to end. All events you can see at the exhibition describe the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire and show that the Poles were the first begin the dismantling of the Berlin Wall. I must say that I truly believe that Gdansk will not be remembered only because of its beautiful place with the 1,000 years of the history, or that it witnessed the first shot of a long and horrible World War II. I'm sure, or I would rather say I hope, that the city will remain in the memory of next generation because of the events in the shipyard. Events which reveal the true soul of the Polish people, that human part of our soul. They fight for dignity and freedom, led them to stand shoulder by shoulder, one for all, and all for one. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a slogan of famous Nevada city, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. I believe that the slogan about Gdansk is, what happens in Gdansk does not stay in Gdansk, moves throughout the whole world. Thank you.
it was a remarkable time, and I don't think, I've often said to my Polish friends, I don't think even Poles really fully appreciate the impact that they had on the rest of the world, or do it as deeply as they should. Anyway, what I'd like to talk about is to try to make some of the arc between 1980 and 1989, because I think it fits in quite well with what's happening in the news today, especially in North Africa. And just some thoughts that, and some things that when the exhibit was opened in New York, I was lucky enough to be asked to say a couple of words, and I talked about the underground press and the role it played, especially after martial law. So I'm going to try to tie all of that together a little bit. And as I said, it's very difficult to watch what's going on in the Middle East these days and not think about 1980, Poland, 1981. And there are a lot of parallels, but as the Consul General noted, there was not only no social media at the time, there were hardly any telephones at the time. And yet, in spite of this lack of social media, the Polish people rose up, eventually were suppressed, but eventually emerged victorious against one of the most comprehensive authoritarian systems of rule ever invented by mankind. I don't know how many of you have read anything about the Soviet model, the Leninist model, but it was a terrific way of controlling the population, much more effective than most of the stuff that you see in the Middle East these days. Anyway, so just briefly, so how did this happen? Well, in Poland had, maybe like Egypt, they share some similarities, a strong sense of history. Poland has perhaps, I'm of Czech descent myself, and I don't think Czechs quite view their country in historical terms the way the Poles do theirs. There's also a very shared sense of the deprivation and surreality of life in communist Poland. You had nothing, but everybody had nothing. I remember walking past a big department store in downtown Poland, and all they had in the window were empty boxes of tea as pyramids. You lined up for everything, for bread. And yet, Poles also had these wonderful survival skills, many of which centered around their sense of humor. Jokes kept everybody alive. They used to say the government pretends they pay us and we pretend we work. They also had a common sense of the way the government was lying. Back in the 1970s, the regime at that time started something called the propaganda of success, in which they decided that they would make everybody feel better about living in a country that didn't have much by pretending to have a lot. And they would have TV shows with new cars rolling off the assembly line and television sets, and everybody knew that none of this existed. So there was a great skepticism, and there's little wonder that the trade union, the workers initially responded as they did to Polish journalists. Another thing that happened, and here's where I think we start to get some separation with what's going on now. In the 1970s, there was a realization among Polish intellectual dissidents that they had to make common cause with the workers. It is very commonplace in many civilizations for the intellectual elite to sit in their ivory towers and tell people how to live their lives and how they should resist. And in the 1970s, people in KOR, especially Jacek Kuran and many others, decided to make an outreach to the workers. And so this began in the 74, 75. So that had been going on for 5 or 6 years before the Gdansk strike.
76, that was the big
76 was cool. And this is important because one of the things that I certainly learned in my years of covering places like Poland and China, repressive governments succeed by atomizing the population, by making people afraid to share what they really feel about what's going on. It's very, very difficult. You don't know who's gonna report you to the police. And if you, I don't know if any of you have seen, I'm not gonna be able to, the East German movie, Other People's Lives, but I highly recommend it. It's a tremendous, if you want to get a sense for what it was like to be an individual in the Soviet bloc in that era, it's one of the best things you could possibly watch. Anyway, the Pope's visit in 1979 de-atomized, if you will, Polish society, because all of a sudden people looked around and they were surrounded by people who were not afraid to stay home. Because the government, although they invited them in, made it very difficult for people to show up, and you had millions of people showing up for these rallies. And so you looked next to you and you saw someone that you never would have thought would have gone to something like that. And so it began to wither away this atomization. And then, as the Consul General said, you had outside bits of information, Radio for Europe, Voice of America, the Vatican Radio. And again, if you want to make a comparison with today, Al Jazeera has played a similar role. It's actually sort of sad that Voice of America doesn't really have that kind of clout anymore. So when the agreement that was reached in 1980 fell apart rather quickly. And part of the problem was that Solidarity itself was not all that solid. It was composed of many, many different organizations, many different people. There were strikes all over the country. Some of the strikes were frivolous. I covered, Lech Walesa was Times Man of the Year in 1981, so I spent a lot of time traveling around the country with him in the fall of 1981, and he was losing his hair practically over the antics of some of his colleagues. And so the government was able to sow dissension and raise some of the doubts about Solidarity's ability to be an effective partner. After martial law, the government re-atomized society, at least partially through selective arrests. They didn't arrest everybody. They only arrested about a third of the people that should have been arrested. And so the other 2/3 would sort of say, well, I know I'm okay, but why weren't you arrested? Maybe you were a collaborator. It was brilliant.
What's wrong with me?
Huh?
What's wrong with me that I'm not arrested?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, the other thing they did, and when the Egyptian government closed the internet the other day, I thought that was like a month ago. That was interesting. But in Poland, what they did after martial law was declared was they pulled the plug on the telephone system. They had just bought a new computerized telephone switching system from the French, and they just threw the switch, which knocked out all telephone communications. I think they thought they were going to do that for a week or so, but then they had also wiped out the programming for it, so that there was no telephone for 3 months, no external communications. Anyway, it was all meant to atomize society. So then how did Poland overcome this? How did Solidarity overcome this enormous setback? Oops. First of all, the inherent cohesiveness of the society was not destroyed, and people grasped at simple ways of showing solidarity. For instance, in some places, people would take their television in the summertime, and when the state news came on, whenever it was 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, anyway, they would take their television and point it out the window. And so not watching it. It was just, there were lots of things that, people did, funny things, a lot of word-of-mouth demonstrations. The churches played a big role. At Easter time, they would have these, they're called caves, where they showed basically the Easter story, but they would all have sort of political meanings to it. The 13th of every month would be a march somewhere always in Warsaw, but in many other cities, because that was the day that martial law was declared, and so people knew that was the time to go out. Pirate radio stations, low-wave FM, but the really successful thing, and what to me set this apart and made 1989 possible, was the underground press. A lot of scholarly work has been done on the Polish underground press. If you're interested in this thing, sort of thing, I recommend it that you do a little bit of research. It wasn't just a bunch of people running off anti-government pamphlets. They were printing whole, 300, 400-page books, and not just books on politics, but books on literature, science, economics. How does a market economy work? What's a stock market? What's the difference between the French presidential system and the American presidential system? And the beauty of this is because it was forbidden, it was all underground, it was all printed on tissue paper, everybody wanted to read it. So all of a sudden, you had the best educated people in Europe, from a civic point of view, from economic point of view. This was the foundation for everything that happened in 1989. In fact, it was so successful that some of these underground publishing houses, and there were hundreds of them, some of them actually made money. They were running, and Poles are terrific, capitalists. They were making money out of this. And in fact, several of them have lived on afterwards, and are major organizations in modern-day Poland. Anyway, so this social cohesion made it impossible for the government to use its atomization tactics and kept people from being willing to sell out. The government in '88, just before that strike, tried to put through a new reform program because let's be honest, the reason the strikes were going on in 1980 was that prices were going up. Yeah. But prices had to go up because they had nothing. I mean, it was, the economy was a mess. But in communist Europe, there was a social contract, and the social contract was, we'll give you economic stability, you give us political docility. You keep your mouth shut, and we'll keep your stomach full. Mm-hmm. And in 1980, that began to break apart. In 1989, the government tried a new set of economic reforms, and Solidarity and its successors had enough social cohesion to say, no, we're not going to go along with it. And so the government was presented with a situation where the economy was going to collapse, and that was what led eventually to the roundtable talks. And so when that chance came in 1989, Poland was ready. Poland was not ready in 1980 to take on communism, but it was an important first step.
Russia wasn't ready as well.
No, exactly. And Gorbachev, we can have a whole separate talk about it. Anyway, I asked many Polish friends and many of my colleagues subsequently, if, at the beginning of 1989, if I told you that there was going to be, that Solidarity was going to wind up taking over the government, how do you think they would react? How do you think they would do? I don't think anybody thought they were going to do that well. Mm-hmm. I think people were quite frightened, in fact. The government totally underestimated the popularity and their own unpopularity. Solidarity winds up winning this amazing electoral victory on June 4th of 1989, the same day as the Tiananmen Square massacre, which is one of the reasons that maybe Poland doesn't quite get the credit that it deserves for what happened. Anyway, Poland didn't mess up. They handled this well. The other governments in Eastern Europe did not, the people who ran it, the tyrants who ran these other, they didn't have this image that many people thought would be, that, that all the communists would be arrested. Mm-hmm. Right? That there would be revenge. There was no revenge.
Like in the revolution.
Exactly. And this is what made the rest of 1989 possible. The Polish people had reached this level of political sophistication and acceptance of reality that made it possible for the rest of Eastern Europe to win its freedom. It would not have happened had it not been for what Poland did in 1980, but more importantly, how they handled 1989. And that was done through what, the social media, if you will, of the time, which was the underground press. But it was a slow and gradual process. So again, circling back to the Middle East right now, maybe Egypt has some of that in place. But a lot of the other places, certainly Libya, would not. So it'll be a very bumpy ride. But it's 1981 to 83, best years of my career, and the world owes a great debt of gratitude to Poland.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers for the invitation. When I was preparing these remarks, I decided to take a slightly different tack and give you a bit of a meta-narrative to talk about the exhibit rather than about the content of the exhibit, and I'm very glad I did that, because the introduction that Professor Kalinowska and the Consul General and Mr. Hornik gave was just wonderful. Full of sort of basic, gave the basic frames as well as the anecdotes of what a social movement is like. And I enjoyed listening to it. I would like to contribute to it, but it would be repeating what they said or what's in the exhibit. What I want to do is talk about how the exhibit came to be, the idea that we had to try to make it different from other exhibits, segue into reading an exhibit, reading history, and then concluding with an invitation to all of you, but especially to the students, to participate and to give us some feedback around the quotations. So when we, the idea first came up, it was at the Consul General's request. A small group met, and she pointed out that it's 30 years since Solidarity was founded in Gdansk in 1980. What are we going to do? Various ideas. Well, let's have an exhibit. Well, there's been many exhibits before. What would be novel about this? And we tried to think of what we could do to make it not only different, but in a way interactive and perhaps even intercultural. For the exhibits on solidarity that I've been to, and they've been a few, or not a few, there's two audiences: the Polish audience, the American audience. The Polish audience knows everything that they need to know. They're there to celebrate. The American audience knows something, picks up some information, but they're the beneficiaries of a didactic process. I mean, all exhibits are didactic. They're all one-sidedly didactic. They're teaching you something. So what we wanted to do is to sort of tone down the celebration, to tone down the one-way didacticism, and to try to make it somehow interactive, to make these two audiences perhaps confront each other in a good way, to communicate to one another, I should say, rather than confront. And we hit upon a technique which was to juxtapose the story of solidarity with quotations from American social movements. This is not a scholarly comparison. This is a very personal comparison. So the quotations are those that occurred to us as we were making the exhibit. The idea was to inspire thinking, comparison. They are a series of hints. So we would hope that Poles who looked at the exhibit would see connections between the Solidarnosc that they know so well and the American experience, and that Americans would be able to look for familiar echoes, experiences in the photographs and the anecdotes in the stories of solidarity activists. Seems to me that if this technique works, each of these two audiences will learn something, not just about others, but also about their own experiences. And we really hope that this technique and this exhibit will inspire this kind of dynamic. The crowning glory of this technique would be to find an exhibit on an American social movement that would use quotations from the solidarity experience. Let me say a few things about what you're looking at when you're looking at at human solidarity, Polish Solidarność. First of all, 20 plates. They should be read in sequence. They do tell a story. They start somewhere, they go somewhere. We want to place this event, the rise of a nonviolent social movement, and it's curious because this exhibit ends at the beginning. So the things that Richard Hornik talked about, which was the dynamics of, those happened after the last plate of this exhibit, the victory of setting up the Solidarity trade union. We want to recall other movements that were important in the 20th century and that really changed the world that we're inheriting from that 20th century and into the 21st. The plates have 4 essential elements. They have the photographs, they have eyewitness testimonies, they have a narrative storyline, and they have the quotations from American movements. So when you come up to each plate, I would suggest that you take it in at a glance. Get the impact of the entire plate. The photograph dominates the title. You'll be able to see the narrative, which is on most plates written at the top. It takes you from one plate to the other. The testimonies are oral history in large part. Some are translations of documents, but those fill in the details. So you can spend as much time, or you can just go from impression to impression. But then I really would ask you to look at those quotations from the American experience. They're meant to be part summary, part pinprick, part goad, part inspiration. See how they fit. I do want to talk specifically to the Stony Brook students now. My invitation to you is, in looking at this exhibit, to tag it. I mean that metaphorically, so leave your spray paint at home. But to go plate by plate and see what quotation you would have put there. I mean, these were our decisions. What are yours? It involves a different, it involves a self-conscious reading of the exhibit, a self-conscious reading of history. And with due lack of humility, let me suggest 3 sort of ways of reading history that might be useful. How to read history, how to read this exhibit. First, by squinting. You squint past the details and look for the patterns. Look for the similarities and shapes that you could see are recognizable in other experiences, other times, other places. The iconic woman who initiates the movement. We have a quote from Rosa Parks juxtaposed with Anna Walentinowicz. It just seemed not only natural, but unavoidable. The details are different, but the human emotions are ever the same. Fear, hope, courage to take a risk, take a sacrifice, wondering how to get out of a hopeless situation. You look at the earlier plays, small groups trying to plan a demonstration in a situation that looked completely hopeless. That moment is present in every social movement. Second, first by squinting, second by suspending your knowledge of ultimate victory. We look at these events now and we know, yes, of course it had to happen because so many good people, they were all in communication. For the people then, and as I think was said eloquently already, at the Gdansk shipyards before 1989, in 1989, nobody was sure that how things would turn out. Read Taylor Branch's history of the civil rights movement. The beatings, the jailings, the murders in the American South meant that very good people, decent people, white and black, declined to march because they were afraid, and they were justified in being afraid. The large numbers of those marchers were very young children, sort of middle school kids. Again, what connections, what comparisons will come up in your minds as you look at these plates? And the third thing is, look for the motivations of individuals, people that you see on these plates. Why would they decide to get involved, despite the fear, despite the surveillance, despite the arrests? And we have to say, despite the culture which says it's no use. Why stick your neck out? All right, a few examples of what this different kind, maybe, of reading history might produce. All of those quotations that you see on the exhibit are my favorites, but I just picked three. Maybe my favorites are just good examples. The first one, sociological, philosophical, perceptive. It comes from Martin Luther King. A riot is at bottom the language of the unheard. Every government, every police chief in the world condemns riots, destructive, violent, dangerous. Martin Luther King says, well, if you squint, you will see a real grievance that's being expressed. It's a pattern that's recognizable in Poland, and it's recognizable in the American South, and I guess recognizable in the Middle East today. Another kind of quote, more practical, more hard-nosed, also very perceptive. They'll shoot us quicker. They'll shoot us quicker if we're armed. This comes from a SNCC activist, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I thought about that, placing it. I said, well, if we conducted a poll in the Gdansk shipyards among the workers and asked them, are you a pacifist? I would say, nobody would say, I'm a pacifist. I believe in fighting for what's right. I believe in patriotic military service, blah, blah, blah. If you would ask the same person, is this a nonviolent movement? He would say, yes, of course. Part of that truth is they will shoot us quicker if we're armed. If you went back to the history of SNCC, were there pacifists in that movement? Yes, there were. Were they all pacifists? Did they all stick to it until the end? No. But again, it was a practicality and and a sensibility, and also a philosophy. And then the last thing, maybe the simple statement that I think ties it all together, the statement from Anna Walentinowicz, which is the woman who was the crane operator who was fired, and workers started to defend her, and that's the spark that set off the entire Gdansk Shipyard strike and led to the founding of Solidarity. She said, why can't people understand something as simple as that? If one person stands up, and the next person stands up, and the next person stands up, they can't fire everybody, they can't arrest everybody. Why can't people understand as simple as that? And I would say that summarizes every social movement, and it's a way of looking at another's experience through our own. So I promised an invitation. If this were my class, I would say, all right, everybody break up into groups of 6. Let's talk about this. Come up with your own quotations for specific plates, and then we'll discuss the results. Maybe it's a good thing we can't do that. But what I would like to ask you to do is, when you go out and look at the exhibit, keep that in mind. In other words, as you go plate by plate, see what you would have put in place of that, of the quotation that's there. And we would like to hear from you. If you have ideas, have quotations that you would like to suggest, please send them to us. I wish I could right now give you the address, but I'll ask the organizers here to collect those, because in fact that would be the greatest result of this exhibit and this event. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to start by thanking Isabella for inviting me to be on this important and very interesting panel with these my esteemed colleagues, and for Andres for writing such a beautiful exhibit. I was really moved when I first received it to comment. In the spirit, actually, of the project, I want to talk about the American context here, and specifically tell two stories from the American Civil Rights Movement that, like Solidarity, was nonviolent and anti-systemic civil society-led movement. The two stories are well known. We read them all in history books. But I want to sort of retell them today to highlight just how these two descriptive terms, nonviolent and anti-systemic, are not quite right when judged from the moment a movement that seeks a fundamental break from the past is born, right? The moment before, as Andreas said, no one knows what's going to happen. On Sunday night, January 31st, 1960, four best friends sat in their college dorm room. They were four 17-year-old freshmen. They were planning to do something remarkable. They decided that night that the next day they were going to the lunch counter at Woolworth's department store and, as they said, just ask for service. What was remarkable was the four of them were black, and black people were not allowed to eat at the counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. They didn't call it a sit-in. They were just going to go down to Woolworth's and ask for service, with the tactic as simple as this: we'll just stay until we get served. But it's interesting to see from the perspective of the four kids. They didn't know how long that would be. One of the group, Ezell Blair, when interviewed later, said to the other three in the dorm room, well, you know, that might be weeks, that might be months, it might be never. So yes, the civil rights movement in the United States, just like the Solidarity movement in Poland, were expressly nonviolent movements. But this is how we interpret them today. At that pause, that sort of pregnant moment between when an oppressed group of individuals call for some sort of systemic disruption, a sit-in, a bus boycott, a worker strike, and the moment that that action is carried out, there is very real violence. The four college kids didn't know what was going to happen. Blair continued in the interview, the question that all of us asked ourselves was, what's going to happen? What's going to happen once we sit down? Even your wildest imaginations couldn't leave you to believe what would in fact happen, what we now read in the history books. As in, what we now read of as a nonviolent struggle, at that very moment, at the very beginning, when they sat down, was everything everything about it was violent. It's a form of warfare. What today seems inevitable and nonviolent was on Monday, February 1st, 1960, anything but. The moment after you sat down, Blair was asked later, were you afraid? His response, oh, hell yes, no question about that. Ironically, it is the violence itself that both, on the one hand, necessitates nonviolent tactics, and on the other hand, makes them so successful. Blair continued, describing the police officer in the store where they were sitting. He was pacing the aisle behind where we were seated, with his club in his hand, and just looked mean, upset, and a little bit disgusted. And had that feeling that he didn't know what the hell he'd do. You had that feeling that this was the first time that this big bad man with a gun and a club had been pushed in a corner, and he's got absolutely no defense. And the thing that's killing him more than anything else is he doesn't know what he can do or what he cannot do. He's defenseless. Usually his defense is offense, and we've certainly provoked him, but not in a way that enables him to resort to violence. We knew that probably the most powerful and potent weapon that people have literally no defense for is love, kindness. That is, whip the enemy with something he doesn't understand. Story 2. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for not yielding her seat to a white man on a bus. On December 4th, 1955, community leaders call for a bus boycott. On December 5th, when people wake up in the morning, the organizers have no idea what's going to happen. Again, that moment when history is not written. What will happen? Will just us not ride the bus? Will everyone not ride the bus? What's going to happen? Well, they woke up and no black people rode the buses. They didn't ride the bus that day. They didn't ride the bus the next day. They did not ride the bus for 381 days. Yes, the civil rights movement, as well as the solidarity movement, were also anti-systemic. The movements were seeking a fundamental break from the past. But this term is also misleading because it implies that civil society below the governing elite is not really there under oppressed conditions, not part of the system, and that the only real system is that created by the oppressed state authorities, the governing elite. But what is transformed in such moments, in such movements, is not just the larger system of oppression, be it the Jim Crow South or the Eastern Bloc, but the very relationship ordinary people have to each other. It's captured best in the very term, solidarity. These relationships are transformed in a profound way. I have a right to be here. I have a right to a dignified identity. I have a right to this place. This is what I have to say now. During the bus boycott, Martin Luther King was said to have encountered an elderly lady on the street one afternoon, walking, of course, where she needed to be. He said, "Now listen, you've been with us all along, so now you go on and start back to riding the bus, because you're too old to keep walking." She looked up at Dr. King and said, oh no, I'm going to walk just as long as everybody else walks. I'm going to walk until it's over." So he said to her in reply, "But aren't your feet tired?" "Yes, my feet is tired," she said, "but I'm not walking just for me. My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." Her dignity as a human being was reclaimed from those who had denied it, respect restored. And once this transformation takes place within the system, within an active civil society that people assume is not there, there is nothing that could get her on that bus. Nothing left for her state oppressors to do but allow her into a newly configured, democratic, and exclusive new system. I want to close with a message to the students in the room. We look back on these movements, and when you're taking classes and professors are professing about these social movements some of your professors participated in the United States, and we get a sense that these are big, huge movements, organized, large. You see the pictures, right? But that's how they end up being. That's how they end up being in the end in the history books. And we get a sense that there's nothing really we could do as people. And students always ask me, why aren't we as politically active as the 1960s? Well, nothing could be further from the truth, this idea that has to be organized and big, anti-systemic. And I'm not saying that everyone has the time, energy, or finances to refute every lie, fight every injustice, agitate against all wrong everywhere. But what these two movements juxtapose so brilliantly in this project show, the American Civil Rights Movement and the Solidarity Movement, what they show for the future going forward is that sometimes good can come, that sometimes things can happen when from time to time we can, individually or collectively, communicate a general indication of where we stand. Thanks.